The last video ended with a question, not a comfortable one, not the kind you can answer and move on from, the kind that follows you. If the system that governs what you can build on your own land was assembled in a single decade, deliberately, quietly, and with a coordination that official history has never fully explained, then the question that comes next is almost unbearable in its simplicity. What do you do about it? That is what this investigation is about. Not the architecture of control. We have already walked through that. This is about the doors they forgot to close, the cracks in the framework, the places where the gate was never fully built, or where people found ways around it so quietly and so persistently that the system has never quite managed to seal them off. Because here is what I kept finding the deeper I went. The system is vast. It is coordinated. It is self-reinforcing in ways that make it feel immovable, but it is not complete. And the people who noticed the gaps did not write about them in newspapers or announce them at public hearings. They simply walked through them, quietly, practically, with the same hands-in-the-dirt resourcefulness that built the Ohio farmstead in 1903 before anyone thought to ask permission. This raises a simple but critical question. If the right to build freely was taken within a 10-year window, are there places where that window never fully closed? The answer is yes. And the geography of that answer is more specific, more detailed, and more actionable than most people ever get told. Let me start with the most obvious escape route, because it is the one most people stumble upon first, and the one the system is most careful never to discuss loudly. In the United States, zoning law is not federal. It is not even state law in many cases. It is municipal. It is county level. It is hyper-local, in a way that the Standard Zoning Enabling Act of 1926 created the template for, but never fully mandated the implementation of, which means that what is required of you in Los Angeles County is not required of you in a rural county in eastern Tennessee. What is required of you in the suburbs of Chicago is not required of you on 40 acres in the interior of Wyoming. The gate was built everywhere, but it was not built to the same height everywhere, and in some places, it was barely built at all. There are counties in the United States today, documented, legally functioning jurisdictions, where no building permits are required for residential construction, not in a loophole sense, not in a gray area requiring a sympathetic sheriff, simply absent, not required, not enforced, not part of the county's administrative apparatus because the county never built that apparatus, or dismantled it, or never had the population density to justify the cost. Rural counties in Missouri, in Texas, in Montana, in New Mexico, in parts of Appalachia. Counties where the 10-year window that reshaped everywhere else left behind something closer to what existed before. Not lawless, not unstructured, just ungated in the specific foundational sense that you can stand on land you own and build on it without first asking someone who has never stood there for their written approval. The deeper I went into this, the more the pattern emerged. Not chaos in these places, not the collapse of civic order, just people building what they needed on land they owned. The same practical reality that existed across the Western world before 1916, persisting quietly in the jurisdictions that were too rural, too small, or too stubborn to fully participate in the redesign. And here is where it gets interesting. Because the system knows these places exist, the official explanation for their persistence is always the same. They will catch up eventually. Population growth will force the issue. It is only a matter of time. But that explanation has been offered for decades, and the counties persist. Some of them have persisted for over a century since the template was issued, not catching up, simply continuing. This raises a simple but critical question. If the system is inevitable, why does it require this much waiting? But rural relocation is not available to everyone, and the people who designed the gate understood that. The escape route that requires you to sell everything and move to a county with no code enforcement is an escape route available only to those with the resources and flexibility to move. For everyone else, the system made sure to leave a narrower door, one that looks almost like generosity, owner-builder exemptions. In many states across the United States, in significant portions of Canada, in parts of Australia and New Zealand, there exists a legal provision that most people who own property have never been told about. The owner-builder exemption allows a person who owns land, under specific circumstances and within specific limits, to construct structures on that land, without the involvement of a licensed contractor, sometimes without permits, sometimes with reduced permit requirements. The scope varies enormously by jurisdiction. In some states it is narrow, applicable only to single-family residences and ringed with conditions. In others it is surprisingly broad, extending to agricultural structures, workshops, outbuildings, and secondary dwellings. And in almost every jurisdiction where it exists, it is not advertised. You will not find a pamphlet at the county building office explaining your exemption rights. You will find the opposite, a process designed to guide you toward the full permitting apparatus, toward the licensed contractor, toward the inspection schedule, and away from any conversation about what you might legally be permitted to do without all of that. The silence was deafening and deliberate, because the owner-builder exemption is a crack in the gate. It is the residual legal recognition that the person who owns land retains some practical sovereignty over it. A recognition narrow enough to be tolerable to the system, but real enough, if you know it exists, to change what is possible. But knowledge that is not transmitted dies. And the knowledge of owner-builder rights has not been transmitted. It has not appeared in the standard curricula through which people learn what property ownership means. It has not been featured in the paperwork given to new homeowners at closing. It has not been mentioned by the contractors and inspectors and permit offices that form the human interface between ordinary people and the land they own. It persists in legal statutes, documented, technically accessible, and functionally invisible to the vast majority of people who would benefit from knowing it exists. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Now, I want to talk about the agricultural exemption, because this is where the escape routes become genuinely significant for anyone willing to look clearly at them. In almost every jurisdiction that has zoning law, there is an exception carved out for agricultural use. Structures that serve a farming or agricultural function are treated differently from residential or commercial structures in the permit and zoning apparatus across most of the United States, across much of Canada, and in various forms throughout the Western world. The rationale given is practical. Farming requires flexibility. The needs of a working agricultural operation are too dynamic to be subject to the same bureaucratic timeline as residential construction. The official explanation is accurate. The implication it carries is the part they do not want you to examine, because an agricultural exemption is not limited to large-scale commercial farming in most jurisdictions. It applies to properties that are classified as agricultural, and agricultural classification is, in many places, more accessible than the system makes it appear. A modest acreage, evidence of productive agricultural activity. Chickens, a vegetable operation, a small orchard, a hayfield. In a surprising number of counties and states, these can qualify a property for agricultural status, and agricultural status opens the door to structures that residential zoning would otherwise require months of permitting and thousands of dollars in fees to build. Barns, storage buildings, workshop structures, processing facilities. On an agriculturally classified property in many jurisdictions, these structures can be built with dramatically reduced permitting requirements or none at all, not as a loophole, not as a workaround, as a direct legal provision that has existed since before the zoning system was built, because the people who built the zoning system were careful enough to know that applying it fully to working, agricultural land would create political resistance they could not manage. So they left the door open. The deeper I went, the more I found people who had discovered this door and walked through it. Not radicals, not ideological resistors, just practical people who looked at the land they owned and the structures they needed and the legal framework governing their specific parcel and found that the gate had a hinge they had never been told about. But there is a layer beyond individual action, a layer that I think is the most important part of this investigation and the one most consistently missing from the conversation. Because the question is not only how individual people navigate a system designed to restrict them, the question is whether the system itself is beginning to shift. And the evidence suggests it is, not uniformly, not comfortably, but in ways that are real enough and growing enough that the official narrative of the system's permanence is starting to look like the defensive posture it has always been. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision in state legislatures over the past decade. Montana passed legislation in 2023 dramatically curtailing the ability of municipalities to restrict residential construction through exclusionary zoning. Texas has pursued similar deregulatory measures. targeting local permit overreach. New Hampshire has long maintained among the loosest owner-builder provisions in the country and has resisted pressure to tighten them. Arizona has moved against restrictions on accessory dwelling units that would otherwise require full permitting compliance. These are not isolated anomalies. These are data points in a pattern of legislative pushback against the system that was built in that 10-year window. Pushback that is growing in volume, in geographic spread, and in political legitimacy in ways that would have been difficult to predict even 15 years ago. This raises a simple but critical question. If the system was built in 10 years, what makes anyone certain it cannot be unmade in the same span? The official explanation for why deregulation cannot work is always the same. Public safety. Building codes protect occupants from structural failure, from fire, from systems that can harm the people inside them. The argument is made as though the alternative to the current system is structures that collapse and burn, as though the knowledge that built durable homes for centuries before permits existed has been lost so thoroughly that without an inspector's signature, a wall cannot stand. The argument collapses here. Because the jurisdictions with looser permit requirements do not have higher rates of structural failure, the states with broader owner-builder exemptions do not have epidemics of collapsing self-built homes. The rural counties where permits are not required have not become landscapes of uninhabitable structures. What they have are people living in homes they built themselves, on land they own without asking permission, and the homes are standing. That fact does not appear in the literature produced by the system that depends on your continued belief that its oversight is necessary, but it is there in the data for anyone willing to look. Now, I want to tell you about something that official history barely acknowledges, something that has been growing quietly on the margins of the mainstream for decades, and is now large enough that it cannot be ignored. The intentional community movement, the land trust model, the organized, deliberate attempt by groups of people to reconstruct within the framework of the existing system, something that approximates the sovereignty that individual land ownership no longer reliably provides. A community land trust takes property out of the speculative market permanently. It holds land in trust for the benefit of its residents, removing the assessed value tax spiral by structuring ownership in ways that shield residents from the mechanisms most responsible for the perpetual rental quality of modern property ownership. In a land trust structure, you own your home. You do not own the land beneath it in the traditional speculative sense, which means your annual obligation to the system does not compound with every improvement you make. The improvement is yours. The appreciation is constrained, and the gate, while not absent, is smaller. The deeper I went into this model, the more I found it functioning not as a fringe experiment, but as a proven, replicable, legally functioning alternative that operates within the existing system while quietly dismantling some of its most extractive mechanisms. Burlington, Vermont has one of the oldest and best documented community land trusts in the United States. It has been running since 1984. The homes in it are standing. The people in them are building their lives. And the assessed value spiral that prices ordinary people permanently out of ownership in the surrounding market has been, for the residents of that trust, interrupted. Not revolution, not confrontation, paperwork, the same tool that built the gate, used to quietly prop it open. And then there is the tiny home question, because the tiny home movement is not, despite how it is often portrayed, a lifestyle trend. It is a legal arbitrage. Most building codes in most jurisdictions establish minimum square footage thresholds, below which certain requirements do not apply. Structures under a certain size are classified differently, permitted differently, sometimes not permitted at all, in the sense that no permit is required. The people who built the system never imagined that people would deliberately choose to live small. The system's concessions to small structures were meant to cover outbuildings, storage sheds, the minor appendages of property that were too modest to warrant the full apparatus. They were not meant to be lived in, and yet they can be. And increasingly, people are. In jurisdictions across the country, in rural and semi-rural settings, where the enforcement appetite is low and the land is available, people are building small structures, legally, permanently, without the full weight of the permit apparatus and living in them. Not because they cannot afford more, sometimes because they cannot, but sometimes because they looked at the gate, understood what it was, and decided to simply walk around it. The evidence suggests something much larger is happening than a collection of individual choices. The people navigating these escape routes are not acting in isolation. They are communicating. They are building networks. They are sharing the specific, practical, legally precise knowledge, knowledge that the system was designed to make invisible. Owner-builder forums with hundreds of thousands of participants. County-by-county databases tracking permit requirements maintained by communities of people who moved specifically to find the places where the gate is lowest. Legal libraries documenting agricultural exemptions, state by state, updated in real time as legislation changes. A shadow information infrastructure built entirely around the knowledge that the official information infrastructure does not want you to have. And that is where this investigation arrives at something that feels important enough to name directly. The 10-year window in which the system was built succeeded in part because it moved faster than public awareness could organize against it. The gate was installed before most people understood what was being built. The language was normalized before the philosophical implications were widely examined. The template was adopted before communities had time to deliberate whether they wanted it. That asymmetry, the speed of installation versus the slowness of public awareness, was the system's greatest advantage. And it is the advantage that is now eroding. Not because anyone has dismantled the system, but because the information is moving faster than it used to. Because the people who found the gaps are describing them in specific, practical, shareable terms. Because the legislative momentum in states that are pushing back is creating a political record that makes the system's permanence harder to defend. Because the generation that grew up never questioning the gate is being followed by a generation that encountered the question early and decided it was worth asking. The system was built in paperwork, and it can be navigated in paperwork. It can be resisted in paperwork. It can be dismantled in paperwork. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic confrontation with a bureaucratic apparatus that has had a century to entrench itself. But county by county, exemption by exemption, land trust by land trust, legislative session by legislative session. The way things are actually changed, quietly, practically, and with the same patience that was used to build what needs to be undone. I started this investigation standing in front of the gate, looking at what was built in that 10-year window and asking who built it and why and what it replaced. Those questions matter. They always will. But the gate is not the end of the story. The gate has hinges. It has gaps. It has jurisdictions where it was never fully installed. It has legal provisions that predate it and survive within it. It has a generation of people who have found those provisions and are using them and are telling each other about them in ways that the system cannot easily suppress because the information is simply too specific, too practical, and too widely distributed to make invisible. Your ancestors built what they needed because they owned the land, and that was enough. That assumption was taken. But it was not taken completely, and the people who have found what remains of it are not waiting for permission to use it. The deeper I went, the more I found that the most powerful thing you can do is know what you are actually permitted to do. Not what the permit office will tell you, not what the contractor who benefits from your dependence on their license will tell you. What the law, in your specific county, in your specific state, with your specific land classification, actually says you may do on land that is yours. That knowledge was made invisible. It can be made visible again, one conversation at a time, one county database entry at a time, one legislative testimony at a time, one structure built by someone who understood their exemption rights and used them. The gate was built in 10 years. The question the system does not want you to ask is whether you are actually standing in front of it or whether you have simply been told you are. Find the gaps, share what you find, and build what you need.